The desert in southern Utah stretches farther than most people imagine, and once you leave the highway behind, the world begins to feel empty in a way that most modern places no longer do. Long dirt roads cut through miles of red earth and dry brush, while massive sandstone mesas rise in the distance like ancient walls that have been standing there for thousands of years. During the day, the desert can feel beautiful and calm under the wide blue sky, but once the sun begins to sink behind the cliffs, the land changes. Shadows grow long across the open ground, and the silence becomes so deep that every small sound carries for miles. Red Mesa Ranch sat alone in the middle of that desert, more than 40 miles from the nearest town, and surrounded by nothing but open land and distant red rock formations. The ranch had been built decades earlier by cattle ranchers who once used the property for grazing livestock across the wide desert plains. Over the years, the place had changed owners many times. Some stayed long enough to work the land for several seasons, while others left after only a few months, sometimes abandoning tools or equipment behind, as if they had left in a hurry. When Daniel Harper first saw the listing online, he barely believed the price. Hundreds of acres of land, a house already standing, working fences, and old cattle pens ready to be repaired. After years of living in the crowded noise of Salt Lake City, the idea of owning a quiet ranch in the middle of the desert felt almost too good to pass up. A few weeks later, Daniel packed everything he owned into his pickup truck and began the long drive south. By the time he turned onto the dirt road that led toward Red Mesa Ranch, the sun had already begun to sink toward the horizon. Dust followed behind the truck as he drove slowly through the open desert, the road stretching straight ahead between scattered sagebrush and dry earth. For nearly 20 minutes, he saw nothing but empty land. No houses, no lights, no people anywhere in sight. Then finally the ranch appeared. The house stood alone in a wide clearing surrounded by fencing that stretched across the land in several directions. The building was older than the photos had suggested. The wood faded by decades of desert sun and wind, but it still looked solid enough to live in. Daniel stepped out of the truck and looked around at the massive open land surrounding him. The sky was burning orange and red as the sun dropped behind the mesas in the distance, and for the first time in years, there was no sound of traffic or city noise anywhere around him. Only the quiet desert air and the faint wind moving through the dry brush. It felt exactly like the life he had been hoping for. Over the next several days, Daniel began settling into the ranch. He cleaned dust from the rooms inside the house, repaired sections of the fence line, and explored the land surrounding the property. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, and sometimes when he stood near the outer fences, he could see for miles without spotting another building or road. On the fourth afternoon, while checking one of the fence lines, Daniel noticed something unusual in the dirt beside the property. Large tracks had been pressed into the ground during the night. At first, he assumed they belonged to a coyote or stray dog wandering through the area. But when he crouched down to examine them more closely, something about the prints felt wrong. The shape looked canine, but the size was too large, and the distance between the tracks suggested that whatever made them had been moving with long, powerful strides across the desert. Daniel stood up and looked out toward the open land beyond the fence, but the desert remained empty and silent, under the fading afternoon light. He eventually shrugged and continued his work, assuming it was probably just a large coyote passing through the area during the night. That evening, the desert grew quiet, much earlier than usual. The wind died completely, and the land outside the ranch house fell into a deep stillness that made the empty landscape feel strangely tense. Daniel cooked a simple dinner inside the house and spent some time unpacking the last of his belongings before heading to bed. Hours later, sometime deep in the night, he woke suddenly, without knowing why. For a moment he lay still in the darkness, listening to the quiet house around him. Then he heard it. Slow footsteps moving across the dirt outside the house. At first he assumed it was an animal wandering near the porch, maybe one of the coyotes he had heard howling across the desert on previous nights. But the steps sounded heavier than that. Slower, more deliberate. Daniel sat up in bed and listened carefully as the footsteps moved across the front yard. Then they stopped. The silence that followed felt strangely heavy, as if something outside the house had paused and was now standing perfectly still in the darkness. Daniel got out of bed and walked quietly through the house until he reached the front window. The desert night outside was dark, but the moon hung high above the mesas, casting pale silver light across the open land. For several seconds he saw nothing. The yard was empty, and the fence line stood silent in the distance. Then something moved near the far edge of the property. A tall shape standing near the outer fence where the desert began again. Daniel narrowed his eyes, trying to understand what he was looking at. At first he thought it might be a coyote standing still in the moonlight. But something about the shape was wrong. The body looked too tall, and the legs seemed longer than they should be. The animal stood there for several seconds, without moving, as if it knew he was watching. Then slowly the creature turned its head toward the house. Even from that distance, Daniel could see its eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. Two faint glowing points staring directly at him from across the yard. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the creature did something that made Daniel's stomach drop. It slowly lifted its front legs off the ground and stood up onto two legs. The thing standing near the fence remained perfectly still for several long seconds, and Daniel found himself unable to move as he stared through the window. At first, his mind tried to force a simple explanation for what he was seeing. A trick of the moonlight. A tall coyote standing at an odd angle. Maybe even a stray dog that had wandered across the property. But the longer he watched, the more obvious it became that whatever stood out there did not move like any animal he had ever seen before. Its posture was wrong. The shape of its body looked unnatural in the pale silver light of the desert night. It stood tall for a moment longer, and then slowly lowered itself back onto four legs. The movement looked strangely controlled, almost deliberate, as if the creature had noticed him watching and decided to change the way it stood. Daniel felt a cold tension settle in his chest. The creature remained there for another few seconds, before turning and walking slowly along the fence line. The moment it moved, the illusion of distance disappeared. Even from the house, Daniel could see how large it was. Much larger than any coyote he had seen before. Its body looked thin and stretched, the legs long and narrow as it moved through the moonlit desert. Then it simply disappeared into the darkness beyond the fence. Daniel stayed at the window for another minute, staring out into the empty desert where the animal had vanished. Eventually, the silence returned, and the yard looked completely normal again. No movement, no glowing eyes, just the wide open land under the moon. He finally stepped away from the window and told himself it had just been a large coyote behaving strangely. The desert was full of animals, and sometimes they moved in ways people didn't expect. Still, when he went back to bed that night, he kept replaying the moment in his mind when the creature had stood upright. The movement had looked too smooth, too natural. The next morning, the desert sun rose bright and hot over the red mesas, and the strange feeling from the night before seemed less important under the daylight. Daniel stepped outside with a cup of coffee and walked toward the fence where he had seen the animal standing. The ground there was dry but soft enough to hold tracks. It did not take long before he found them again. The same large prints he had noticed the previous afternoon. But now there were more of them, many more. The tracks moved along the outside of the fence and then circled toward the front of the property, before disappearing back into the desert. Daniel crouched down to study them more closely. The shape still looked like a canine print, but the size was wrong. Each track was nearly twice the size of a normal coyote print. The stride between them was also strange. Some of the steps looked like the creature had been walking on 4 legs. Others were spaced farther apart in a way that almost suggested 2 legs. Daniel stood up slowly and scanned the empty desert around the ranch. The land looked peaceful again under the bright morning sun, but the tracks remained in the dirt, like silent proof that something had been walking around the property during the night. Over the next few days, Daniel continued working around the ranch, but he began noticing more small things that felt slightly out of place. One afternoon, he found one of the outer fence posts knocked partially loose, as if something heavy had pushed against it. Another time, he spotted fresh tracks circling the cattle pens behind the house, even though he had not yet brought any livestock onto the property. At night, the desert seemed louder than before. Coyotes howled more often in the distance, and sometimes Daniel heard something moving slowly through the brush beyond the house long after midnight. On the 6th night, the strange feeling returned stronger than before. Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch after a long day of repairing fencing when a sound outside the house woke him suddenly. At first, he thought it was the wind brushing against the wooden walls, but then the sound came again, a slow, dragging noise moving across the dirt outside the porch. Daniel sat up quietly and listened. The sound stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy and tense, like the desert itself was holding its breath. Daniel walked slowly toward the front window again and carefully pulled the curtain aside. The yard outside looked empty at first glance, but then his eyes adjusted to the moonlight. Something was standing near the porch, much closer than before. The creature was only about 20 yards from the house now. Its thin body stood motionless beside the fence line, the pale moonlight revealing the shape of long limbs and narrow shoulders. Daniel felt his heart begin to pound as he stared at it. The creature lifted its head slightly, and the moonlight reflected in its eyes again. 2 faint lights staring directly toward the house. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then the creature slowly opened its mouth. At first, Daniel thought it might howl like a coyote. Instead, a sound came out that made his blood run cold, a human voice. soft and quiet but unmistakably human. "Hello?" The word drifted across the desert night toward the house. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The creature's mouth moved again. "Anyone there?" The voice sounded wrong somehow. It had the shape of a human voice, but the tone felt hollow and stretched, like someone repeating words they had only heard once before. Daniel stood frozen at the window, unable to believe what he was hearing. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if listening for a response. Then it spoke again. This time the voice sounded closer to normal, almost natural. "Daniel." The moment it said his name, every muscle in Daniel's body went rigid with fear, because he had never told anyone out here his name. And yet something standing in the desert outside his house had just spoken it perfectly. Daniel did not move for several seconds after hearing his name spoken from outside the house. His mind tried to reject what he had just heard, searching desperately for a rational explanation. Maybe someone from town had come out to check on the property. Maybe a traveler had gotten lost in the desert and was calling for help. But even as those thoughts formed, another part of his mind already knew they were wrong. The voice had not sounded normal. It had sounded like someone trying to imitate a human voice rather than actually using one. Slowly, Daniel stepped away from the window, his eyes still fixed on the pale shape standing outside in the yard. The creature remained motionless near the fence, its tall, thin body barely shifting as the desert wind moved faintly across the land. Then the voice came again from outside the house. "Daniel, come outside." The tone was softer this time, almost calm, but something inside the sound still felt wrong. It stretched certain words in strange ways, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Daniel felt the fear growing heavier in his chest. He had grown up hearing stories about the desert and the things that people claimed lived far away from towns and highways. Most of those stories had always sounded like nothing more than local legends meant to scare children. But standing alone in the dark house, with something outside speaking his name, those old stories suddenly felt much less like fiction. He forced himself to step closer to the window again and looked out into the moonlit yard. The creature was still there, but now it had moved several steps closer to the house. Daniel could see its shape more clearly. Its body looked tall and unnaturally thin, with long limbs that seemed slightly too long for the rest of its frame. Its head tilted slowly from one side to the other as if studying the house. The creature's mouth opened again. "Daniel, we need help." The voice sounded almost perfectly human now. The tone carried the same urgency someone might use if they were injured or lost in the desert. But Daniel noticed something else this time. The creature's lips did not move the same way a human mouth would when speaking. The sound came out anyway. His hands began to shake slightly as he stepped back from the window. Whatever was outside was not a person. It was pretending to be one. The creature stood quietly for another few seconds before speaking again. "Daniel, please." The word "please" sounded strained, as if the creature had only recently learned it. Daniel remained silent inside the house. He slowly reached toward the kitchen counter where he had left a flashlight and the small hunting rifle he kept for coyotes. As soon as his hand touched the rifle, the voice outside changed again. The tone lost its calm softness and became something colder. "Daniel." The creature's head lifted slightly, as if it could sense movement inside the house. For the first time, Daniel realized something that made his fear deepen even further. The creature was not simply calling his name. It was listening, waiting for him to answer. Minutes passed in tense silence. Eventually, the creature moved again. It stepped slowly away from the porch and began walking along the fence line toward the side of the property. Daniel remained at the window, watching it carefully. The way it moved across the yard looked wrong in a way that was difficult to describe. Sometimes its body leaned forward like a normal animal walking on four legs. Other times it straightened slightly as if preparing to stand upright again. The creature reached the far edge of the yard and stopped beside the outer fence. Then it turned its head and looked back at the house one last time. Even from that distance, Daniel could see its eyes reflecting faintly in the moonlight. Two pale points of light staring across the desert toward him. Then the creature disappeared into the darkness beyond the fence. Daniel stayed awake the rest of the night with the rifle sitting across his lap. He watched the windows carefully, listening for any movement outside the house. The desert remained quiet until morning. But the strange events did not end there. 2 days later, Daniel decided to drive into the small town located nearly 40 miles north of the ranch. The place was little more than a gas station, a grocery store, and a few small houses scattered along a dusty road. Inside the gas station, Daniel spoke briefly with the elderly man working behind the counter while paying for supplies. During the conversation, Daniel casually mentioned that he had recently moved into Red Mesa Ranch. The old man's expression changed immediately. He stared at Daniel for a long moment before speaking again. "You staying there alone?" Daniel nodded. The man slowly leaned forward on the counter. "You ever hear anything out there at night?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Coyotes, mostly." The old man studied his face carefully. "Coyotes don't talk." The words sent a chill through Daniel's body. The man glanced toward the window of the store, as if making sure no one else was listening before lowering his voice. "Some of the Navajo folks around here say there's things in the desert that wear animal skins," he said quietly. "They call them skinwalkers." Daniel forced a small laugh, even though the story made his stomach tighten. "Just old stories, right?" The old man did not laugh back. "Maybe," he said slowly. "But if you hear something outside your house calling your name, don't answer it." Daniel left the store feeling uneasy as he drove back toward the ranch. The desert road stretched empty beneath the bright afternoon sun, and for a while he managed to convince himself the story was nothing more than local superstition. But when the sun began to sink behind the mesas again that evening, the memory of the creature standing outside his house returned with full force. And deep in the quiet desert surrounding Red Mesa Ranch, something was already moving through the brush as night slowly fell. Daniel returned to Red Mesa Ranch late in the afternoon, with the sun hanging low over the red cliffs in the distance. The desert road stretched empty behind him for miles, and for most of the drive he kept replaying the conversation from the gas station in his mind. The old man's warning echoed louder the closer he got to the ranch. "Coyotes don't talk." The words refused to leave his head. By the time his truck rolled through the gate and into the clearing beside the house, the sky was already beginning to turn orange and purple with the coming sunset. Everything looked normal at first glance. The house stood quiet in the middle of the open land, and the fences stretched across the desert exactly as they had that morning. But as Daniel stepped out of the truck, he immediately noticed something different. The dirt around the front yard was covered in fresh tracks. He walked slowly across the ground, studying them carefully. The prints circled the house several times and moved along the outer fence like something had been pacing the property during the day. The shape was the same as before. Large canine prints pressed deep into the dry soil. But again, the stride between some of the steps looked wrong. Too long, too uneven. As if whatever made them had occasionally been walking upright. Daniel felt a knot forming in his stomach. The creature had returned. And this time it had been walking around the house in broad daylight. He spent the rest of the afternoon checking the fences and cattle pens, while the sun slowly dropped behind the mesas. Every few minutes he found himself scanning the empty desert around the property, expecting to see movement somewhere in the distance. But the land remained still beneath the fading light. When darkness finally settled over the desert, Daniel locked every door and window inside the house. He placed the rifle beside the couch and turned off most of the lights, leaving only a small lamp burning near the living room window. Hours passed slowly as the night deepened outside. The desert grew silent again, the same way it always did after sunset. No wind, no distant coyote howls, just a heavy stillness hanging over the land. Around midnight, Daniel heard the first sound, a slow step somewhere outside near the back of the house. He immediately sat up on the couch and listened. The step came again. Something was walking slowly across the dirt behind the building. The sound circled toward the side of the house, moving with deliberate, careful steps. Daniel quietly picked up the rifle and moved toward the window. The moon was hidden behind thin clouds, but enough pale light covered the yard for him to see shapes in the darkness. At first, the land looked empty again. Then movement appeared near the old cattle pens behind the house. A tall, thin figure stepped slowly out from the shadows of the fence. Daniel felt his chest tighten instantly. The creature had returned. Even from the distance, he could recognize the unnatural shape of its body. The long limbs, the narrow shoulders, the way it moved with slow, careful motions, like it was studying the area around the house. The creature walked along the fence line and stopped near the porch again. This time it stood much closer than before, only a few yards from the door. Daniel held his breath as he watched through the window. The creature slowly turned its head toward the house as if it knew exactly where he was standing inside. Then its mouth opened again. "Daniel." The voice drifted across the quiet desert air. The sound was clearer than before, more confident, almost perfectly human now. Daniel did not respond. He remained still behind the window, holding the rifle tightly in his hands. The creature tilted its head slightly and spoke again. "You don't have to be afraid." The voice sounded calm, friendly. But something inside the tone still felt wrong in a way Daniel could not explain. The creature took a slow step toward the porch. Then another. Its long limbs moved with unnatural smoothness as it approached the house. Daniel could now see more details in the faint light. The creature's body looked like a large coyote, stretched into the shape of something taller and thinner. Patches of rough fur covered parts of its skin, while other sections looked bare and gray under the moonlight. Its eyes reflected the faint light again as it stared directly at the house. The creature stopped at the base of the porch steps. For several seconds, It simply stood there, listening. Then it slowly climbed the first step. The wooden boards creaked softly under its weight. Daniel raised the rifle slightly. The creature climbed the second step and reached the porch. Now it stood only a few feet from the door. Daniel could hear its breathing from inside the house. Slow, deep breaths that sounded almost human, but carried a faint rasp beneath them. The creature leaned its head toward the door, as if smelling the air inside the house. Then it spoke again. This time the voice sounded almost identical to Daniel's own voice. "Open the door." Daniel felt a wave of cold fear move through his body. The creature had perfectly copied the sound of his voice. Outside on the porch, the thing tilted its head slightly and waited. When no answer came, it tried again. "Daniel, open the door." The words echoed softly through the wood of the house. Daniel kept the rifle aimed at the door, but he still did not move. Several long seconds passed before the creature slowly lifted one of its thin hands and placed it against the wooden door. The claws were longer than Daniel had expected. Long, dark fingers ending in sharp, curved tips that lightly touched the wood. Then slowly the creature scratched once across the surface of the door. The sound was soft, but sharp enough to make Daniel's skin crawl. The creature leaned closer and spoke again in a quiet whisper. "I know you're inside." Daniel's finger tightened slightly on the rifle as the scratching sound dragged slowly across the door. The noise was soft but sharp, like bones scraping against wood, and it echoed through the quiet house in a way that made his stomach twist. The creature remained just outside on the porch, its thin fingers resting lightly against the door as if testing the strength of the wood. For several seconds it did nothing else. Then the voice came again from the other side. "Daniel." This time it sounded perfectly calm, almost patient, the way someone might speak to a friend standing just a few feet away. Daniel forced himself to stay silent. Every instinct told him that answering would be the worst possible mistake he could make. Outside, the creature shifted slightly on the porch. The boards creaked quietly under its weight as it leaned closer to the door. "You don't have to hide," the voice continued softly. "We just want to talk." The word we made the air in the room feel suddenly colder. Daniel kept the rifle aimed toward the door while his eyes moved briefly toward the dark window beside it. The desert outside remained still and silent under the moonlight, but something about the way the creature had spoken that word made him wonder if it was truly alone. The scratching came again, a slow, dragging movement of claws across the wood. Then suddenly the creature knocked, 3 slow taps against the door. The sound was almost polite. "Daniel, open the door." The voice now sounded identical to his own voice again, perfect in tone and rhythm. The imitation was so accurate that for a moment Daniel felt a strange, disorienting sensation, as if he were hearing his own thoughts spoken out loud. The creature waited several seconds. When no response came, its tone changed slightly. The calm friendliness faded, and something colder slipped into the voice. "Daniel." This time the name stretched slightly at the end, like something learning the shape of the word. The creature's hand pressed harder against the door. The wood creaked faintly. Daniel's breathing slowed as he steadied the rifle in his hands. If the creature tried to force the door open, he would shoot. Outside the house, the desert remained silent. No wind, No animals, just the presence of something standing on the porch, waiting for him to make a mistake. Another minute passed before the creature finally moved again. Daniel heard the faint sound of its claws sliding down the door as the hand lowered slowly. Then the boards of the porch creaked again as it stepped backward. Daniel kept the rifle raised and waited. The footsteps moved down the steps, one by one. Then the sound faded into the dirt of the yard. Slowly Daniel stepped toward the window again and looked outside. The moonlight covered the yard in pale silver light, but for several seconds he saw nothing. Then movement appeared near the outer fence. The creature had stopped there and turned to face the house again. Now that it stood farther away, Daniel could clearly see how tall it really was. Its body looked thin and stretched, like something wearing the loose shape of an animal rather than truly being one. The head tilted slightly as it stared toward the house. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the creature slowly lifted its head toward the sky and inhaled deeply as if smelling the night air. When it spoke again, the voice no longer tried to sound human. The tone was deeper now, hollow. "Soon," it whispered. The single word drifted faintly across the open desert. Then the creature lowered itself back onto four limbs with a smooth, unnatural motion and began walking away from the ranch. Its long body moved easily through the brush as it disappeared into the darkness beyond the fence line. Daniel remained standing at the window long after the creature had vanished. He waited nearly an hour before finally lowering the rifle. The desert eventually returned to its normal silence. But the feeling that something had been watching the house never truly left him that night. The next morning, Daniel packed several bags into his truck without wasting time. He did not try to convince himself the events of the night had been imagination or stress. Whatever had been standing on his porch had known his name. It had spoken with his voice, and it had promised it would return. By mid-morning, Daniel was already driving north along the long desert road that led back toward the highway and the distant town beyond the mesas. He never returned to Red Mesa Ranch. Years later, the house still stood alone in the same clearing surrounded by miles of empty desert. Locals passing along the dirt road sometimes claimed they had seen large tracks in the dust near the old fence line. Others said strange voices could occasionally be heard drifting across the desert at night, calling softly from somewhere out in the darkness. And sometimes, if someone stopped their car and listened long enough, they might hear a voice quietly speaking a name that did not belong to them.